Welcome to another episode of Oriental Journeys podcast. My name is Ray Behboudi and I'm your host as we explore the fascinating theme of this episode together.
I left Marrakesh in the company of the exalted cortege, that of our master, God strengthen him, and we reached the city of Salah, then the city of Miknasa, the wonderful, the green, the brilliant, with orchards and gardens and with plantations of olives surrounding it on all sides. Then we arrived at the capital Fez, God Most High guard it. There I said farewell to our master and set out on a journey to the country of the blacks. I reached the city of Sijil Masa, a very beautiful city. It has abundant dates of good quality. The city of Basra is like it in the abundance of dates, but those of Sijil Masa are superior. The Irar kind is unequaled anywhere. Here I stayed with the jurist Abu Muhammad al-Bushri, whose brother I had met in Quanjanfu in China. How far apart they are. He treated me with the greatest generosity. Here I bought camels and 4 months' fodder for them.
Ibn Battuta, the most noted explorer of the medieval world, narrated a series of first-hand, comprehensive and historically precious observations on lands to which he traveled over almost 30 years in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler passed through countless communities, cities and lands, and his observations, experiences and encounters have much to tell about the world and its workings in medieval times. Guided and inspired by Ibn Battuta's footsteps, this podcast opens a portal into the world of the East for people who are curious about the past, hungry for the marvels of traveling, and contemplate the wonders of cities. In each episode, we pick a topic to explore the elements of Ibn Battuta's traveling experience, the places he visited, the people he met, the food he tasted, the locations he stayed over, and many more. Accompany us over our journeys into the distant, unfamiliar, and unknown. The Ibadi Muslims, a little-known minority community, have lived in towns and villages of North Africa for over 1,000 years. This lesser-known Muslim community originated from Basra in 7th century, founded their way in 8th century in North Africa, and evolved throughout Middle Ages. Passing through a turbulent history in North Africa, Ibadi Muslims developed a unique system of knowledge transmission, combining peoples and texts with the holy mission of preserving their traditions beyond geographies and across successive generations. To further disseminate their inherited knowledge and protected their marginalized community from being forgotten and lost, Ibadi scholars also became extensively integrated in trade and trade routes, shaping their knowledge networks in tandem with moving commodities between Ibadi hubs. Their cumulative culture is a delicate carpet interwoven with colorful elements, from sophisticated networks and fortified villages in the fringe of the Sahara Desert to dedicated scholars and long lines of affluent merchants. During his travels in North Africa in the 14th century, Ibn Battuta visited the locations of Ibadi Muslims communities and is likely to have been in company with the Ibadi merchants, Ibadi scholars, and Ibadi jurists from across Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. In this episode, we delve into the fascinating world of the Ibadi to explore their community and to better understand their collective history, tradition, and legacies. We set out on this path with interesting observations from our fellow traveler Ibn Battuta and with expert guidance from our guest and subject specialist, scholar, and researcher Dr. Paul Love. Paul Love is Associate Professor of North African, Middle Eastern, and Islamic History at Al Akhawain University in Ifrane, Morocco. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is a former Fulbright scholar and received 3 prestigious critical language scholarships from the United States Department of State. Paul's main research interest is the collective history of Ibadi communities. He researches and writes monographs on Ibadi traditions. His first book, entitled Ibadi Muslims of North Africa, Manuscripts, Mobilization, and the Making of a Written Tradition, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, sheds a new light on Maghribi tradition of Ibadi Islam and the boundaries of the Ibadi communities in the Middle Period. His more recent book, The Ottoman Ibadis of Cairo, published by the same publisher in 2023, traces the same path on Ibadi communities during the Ottoman Empire in Egypt. Paul visits public and private collections in search of Ibadi manuscripts, teaches history courses, and writes a specialized blog on different aspects of Ibadi communities and culture, entitled Ibadi Studies. Darasat Abadiyya. Welcome, Paul. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ray. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Wonderful. Let's start our talk. I can see that you have a very colorful and also very specific study path. Your work is focused on the collective history of Ibadi Muslims in North Africa. What are some of these aspects of Ibadi Muslim communities you're researching, and what started you down this specific and also a specialized study path?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's always such a fun one to think about how you arrive at the thing that you study. I think that for me, I had an interest as an undergraduate student studying history and religious studies in the United States in early Islamic history. And I'm like a lot of students who encounter early Islamic history, and they're interested in the idea of it being a very diverse community very early on. And so I think that was where I first got interested in Ibadis, more broadly in a community called Kharijites. And I think that as my interest developed over time, I just decided this was something that I was especially fascinated by. There were also a series of coincidences that led me to continue to work on the history of Ibadism. So a couple of them were related to those scholarships that you mentioned. I was fortunate as an undergraduate to get some support from the US Department of State to go study in Tunisia. And it was in Tunisia, in southern Tunisia, that I first encountered Ibadi communities. And I was interested just out of curiosity in that. And then I ended up on another grant in Oman, where the largest community of Ibadis lives today. And so it seemed like every place that I would go to, I ended up encountering Ibadis. But I think probably the most transformative experience was I spent a year living in Cairo, and I had the opportunity to audit a class. I wasn't a student at the American University in Cairo, but I got to audit this class with Professor Matt Melchizky, who at the time was teaching this course on Islamic North Africa and Spain. And among other things, we read Ibn Battuta and we read Leo Africanus, and we read a bunch of other really wonderful texts that I learned so much from. And he very generously allowed me to write a paper, and I got interested in Sijil Masa. And as a result, I ended up writing this paper on Sijil Masa that later became the first article that I ever published. But it was through that project in Sijil Masa that I began working on some of the Ibadi manuscripts that were at the Dar al-Kutub library in Cairo. And from there sort of continued in my interest in manuscripts. The other thing I would say is sort of methodologically, I had the tremendous privilege to study at the University of Michigan in the United States for my PhD. And I came in at a really cool time where there were some advanced graduate students who were working on two sort of different but related fields. One was manuscript studies, so that continued to encourage me to study manuscripts, but the other was digital humanities. So I kind of took those two things that my older colleagues and more advanced colleagues were working on and brought them together into the study of Ibadis. And that has sort of defined what I've been doing since then, those kind of two parallel tracks of thinking about humanities in a digital way and also thinking very materially about the stuff of history in the form of manuscripts.
It's so fascinating, and it's a very composite and academic path with a lot of colorful elements. You have connected them together nicely. And as you mentioned, the manuscripts and libraries, Seemingly part of your work has been to map out the collective history of Ibadi communities, which has involved looking at manuscripts, visiting collections held in public and private libraries across the Sahara and Mediterranean regions, and as you said, also in Cairo. Tell us more about your work. What does it involve, and where are you based now?
Well, I am, maybe to start at the end of the question, I am based in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. As you mentioned at the introduction, I'm at the University of El Akhawain. And El Akhawain is an unusual place. It's an English-speaking institution. And this is the place that I've been for the last 9 years. I'm starting my 10th year here, which has been nice because it allows me to continue to do a lot of that work that I started doing as a graduate student, traveling around and going to these different collections. To go back maybe to the beginning of the question about what does that work look like. So the work for the book that we're talking about today was primarily something that I did in graduate school. And that's a very different kind of field work when you are often by yourself and you are funded because you have the opportunity to spend long periods of time doing field work and applying for grants. Those grants all allowed me to do a whole lot of field work that I never could have done before. So when I was doing that field work, I was living mostly in Tunisia, and it was from there that I would travel to different places to visit collections. And the field work I thought I was going to do was all going to be in North Africa, and it was primarily going to be in a handful of different communities in different parts of North Africa. But it ended up taking me also to France, to Ukraine, and for a limited amount of time to the UK to do additional fieldwork as well. And what I would do practically is I was looking for copies of the books that I'm sure we'll talk about. There were these 5 books, and I just essentially wanted to find every single copy of them that I could and to document them and to look at them as objects as much as anything else and understand where they came from and how they moved around.
When you see a manuscript for the first time, what first attracts you, content or the material, because you are expert matter in both? Which one would trigger you and make you excited?
Oh, that's a super cool question. So I mentioned that there was this group of people when I was in graduate school who were interested in manuscripts. One person in particular who I think sort of taught me how to think about manuscripts was the curator of the Islamic manuscripts collection there. Her name is Ebn Kropf. And she's really incredible. And I had the chance to study a bit with her, but also to sort of privately be guided by her. And I think it's thanks to her that when I look at manuscripts, I do tend to look at them as material objects first. So when I first encounter one, I look at how it looks, how it feels, and how it smells, and things like that, long before I think about what's inside of it. I think that that is not because of some sort of like fetishizing of the object. I think it's because my primary research interests over time have developed into who created this object and how did it move around. And the content becomes very important, but the material object itself can tell you so much about it just from looking at it and touching it and sort of handling it. So to give you a sort of concrete example, if I were to encounter a book and I notice that the binding of it has been repaired a bunch of different times, or that the paper, even just from a distance, looks to be 3 or 4 different colors or different grains, that tells me something really interesting about how that book has been used and reassembled over time. And that then affects the way that I think about what I get around to reading eventually in the object itself.
It's amazing. And for the sake of clarifying for myself and for our listeners, when you mentioned that you travel across the world and in different countries, in libraries, in different parts of the world, are you in the search of those copies from the Ibadi communities in different parts of the world?
Oh, yeah, that's an important question. You're absolutely right. So in the case of collections that are in Northern Africa, which were the majority that I worked with, those do tend to still be in the hands of the communities themselves. They may have moved around from one tribe to another or one family to another, but they tend to be in the same geographic locations as the community itself. They did move around quite a bit inside of North Africa. So, for example, if I'm looking at something that's in Algeria, that doesn't mean necessarily it was produced in Algeria. It may have been produced in what was today Tunisia or Libya, or even further afield in Egypt. So that's sort of the North Africa collections. Outside of the Ibadi communities themselves, you find Ibadi manuscripts in a couple of other kinds of places for reasons of modern political history. So those that are not in the hands of Ibadi communities today, but are in those countries, in the Maghrib or in Egypt, that's because of the acquisition of those manuscripts by the government, in particular, the acquisition of endowments, religious endowments, and endowed libraries by modern nation states. So the Algerian National Library or the Tunisian National Library has books there that used to be in private endowed collections, but are now part of national patrimony. The other big category is those that don't belong to Ibadi communities and are outside of Northern Africa and Western Asia. And those are collections that are especially located in Europe and a handful also in North America. And the way that they got there, to make a long story short, is usually colonialism. They were often acquired, sometimes legally and bought, or even the copies were made for Orientalist scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and in other cases are flat out stolen during colonial invasions of those countries. So it's a kind of mixture of those things.
Interesting. I'm hopeful we can get back to this topic later on why colonial powers or European Orientalists got attracted to these copies. But let's now pivot into our main topic, Ibadi communities, their emergence and their evolution. Getting back to very basic definitive terms, what does Ibadi mean literally?
So the term is often, I think, when, especially if people are familiar with Arabic or with perhaps even just with Islam, I think most people who look at that word, because it's spelled Ibadi, they imagine that it's from Ibadah, like the word for worship. But it's actually closer to the word for white, al-abyad. So it's a soft sort of wa sound. And the word originates, it's connected with a person. So it's this guy, Abdullah ibn Ibad. He's a figure that's important for early Ibadi history. He's a religious figure and leader in the early Basran community that you mentioned at the introduction. But he's actually not a super important figure in the grand scheme of things. And so it's kind of curious that the school ended up being associated with this person. But that is the origin of it. So an Ibadiyya are the people who are associated with Ibn Ibad. But there are some really interesting explanations for where it comes from, aside from this individual. But in any case, I think it's fair to say that the Ibadi community, or what we now refer to as the Ibadi community, didn't initially call themselves Ibadis, and instead that's a name that comes from outside of the community as a way to understand and categorize them. And this shows up pretty early on in Islamic history with some pretty early books within the first couple of centuries of Islam, Ibadis being called Ibadis. So that is the origins of the term.
Thank you. And we know that Ibadi Muslims are a community of Muslims which are lesser known. Can you tell us what is their place in the history of Islam and how did they evolve in the Middle Ages from 11th century to 16th? We know that they emerged pretty earlier in 8th century, but their history in North Africa maybe is more prominent in the Middle Ages. Can you tell us about their communities themselves and how did they emerge and evolve?
It's a tremendous responsibility for me, especially as someone from outside of the community, to respond to the question of who they are and what their place is. But I certainly feel convinced of my responses to those things. So I would say that Ibadi communities, at least today, the way that they would probably characterize themselves is as a school among different schools of thought and practice in Islamic history, not necessarily as an offshoot or as a sect of anything else, but a community among different communities and certainly members of a larger Muslim community worldwide, both in the past and the present. But as a distinct community, I mean, the way that I think about what makes Ibadis is about texts and about practice and about community. And I see those things as all interrelated to one another. And so maybe it's for that reason, maybe it's because I use that way of thinking about religious communities as related to texts and practice and living in the same spaces, that when I think about their place in the history of Islam, especially in the period that you mentioned, I think about the community having used texts or worked with texts to create its own sort of boundaries of community. And this is really the sort of the argument of the book, and it's the thing that I became convinced of over time, which is that, yes, absolutely, there is an Ibadi community as early as the 8th century. They even come to North Africa long before the 11th century. But there are things that change in the history of North Africa and the history of Islam that starting in the 11th century, you begin to see for the first time the kind of drawing of the boundaries of a community that make Ibadis distinct. If I were to sort of zoom way out for your question and think about like what is their larger place in the history of Islam, I mean, I think that my colleagues who work especially on Eastern Ibadi communities in places like Iraq and Oman, I think that they have demonstrated pretty convincingly that Ibadi scholars or people that we now think of as members of the Ibadi community in the first few centuries of Islam play really important roles in the early development of Islamic theology and even Islamic law and hadith practices. The point is that they are really involved in the formation of a Muslim community in general in those first few centuries.
And it's great that you brought up the geographical locations of Ibadi communities in Iraq and Oman, because my next question is about this. Ibn Battuta, over his journeys, recounts his contact with Ibadi Muslim communities in two distinct and faraway destinations. The first instance in North Africa, which we also call it the Maghrib, and the second time in Oman. How similar or distinct these Ibadi communities are in East and West, and maybe we need to redefine our concepts about East and West in this context?
Yeah, that's a super important question, and one that I am like halfway qualified to answer, mostly because I don't work a whole lot on the history of Omani communities, but I have over time become familiar with the distinctions among them and the history of their communication. So what I would say in general is that both of these geographic regions, so the Arabian Peninsula and Northern Africa, the Ibadi communities in both of these places recognize a shared origins, as you mentioned at the outset, in the city of Basra, but pretty early on become distinct from one another. And that's for just sort of practical geographic regions. If you were to look at a map of the world and think about the distance that separates what is today the Sultanate of Oman from Algeria, it's a considerable distance. There were opportunities for them to meet one another after the sort of initial development of the communities in, let's say, the 8th and the 9th centuries, especially in Hajj. So Hajj plays a really important role for bringing these different communities together. But I think as a sort of abbreviated answer, what I would say is that these two communities really do develop separate from one another. And you can see that even in textual histories where there's not a lot of exchange of texts between Northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula among scholars. They do occasionally write letters to one another. Like I said, they do meet on Hajj every once in a while. But at least until much later in history, most of the time when they encounter one another, it's an event to write about, which says that it's an unusual thing to have happened. In the Arabian Peninsula, Ibadis relocate out of what is today Iraq to what is today mostly the Sultanate of Oman, and for a brief period of time in what is today Yemen. And in those places, they set up polities, they have political power, they set up sort of, by polity I mean like a state, where they're in charge and they make up the majority. And in Northern Africa, that only really happens one time in the 8th and up to the beginning of the 9th century. And after that, essentially, they are a demographic minority. They're definitely a political minority for the entire rest of North African history. So I think that those things probably also play a role in them developing different kinds of trajectories and imaginings of their community and their boundaries. But then much later in history, they will begin to interact with one another a whole lot more. The 11th to the 16th century period that you mentioned is the beginning of that, but it really only happens in the later centuries, especially in the Ottoman Empire. So I would say that as a kind of summation of all of that they have this shared origin. They sort of geographically break off into two regions that largely develop on their own, with some interaction textually and occasionally in person. And it's only in sort of modern centuries that they've come back together and reimagined their history together.
Interesting. And may I ask, when we say East and West. East refers to the communities in Oman mainly and Yemen, while the Maghrib and the North Africa is called the Western Ibadi communities and tradition.
Yes, I think that that is fair. A little bit later in history, there will also be an Omani community throughout the Indian Ocean. And so that kind of messes up some of the geographic designations because the Omanis are going to control part of the East African coast, which is technically a little bit farther to the west than some of its Western communities. So we don't need to think of them as hard and fast geographic designations, but they're helpful in that one is mostly to the east of the other and one is mostly to the west of the other.
When reading your book, another interesting area for me was the two key groups who played a prominent role in shaping the identity of Ibadi communities in North Africa. One of them is Persians and one of them is Berbers. I would like to know how these carpet of identity evolves over the interplay between these two groups, which from initial glance, it looks weird.
Yeah, absolutely. What a cool question. Thank you for that. So maybe I'll quickly say what the Persian connection is, because if people have never encountered medieval North African history, it may make no sense at all that there would be any Persian connection there. So the dynasty that I mentioned, that polity or that state that Ibadi set up in northern Africa in the 8th century is known as the Rustamid dynasty, from the name Rustum, which for people familiar with Persian literary history is a pretty obvious Persian connection. So the name comes from the person who's regarded as the founding figure of that dynasty, Abdurrahman ibn Rustam. And the idea is that he's part of a group of missionaries that are sent out from Basra to northern Africa and also to other parts of the world to advocate on behalf of this early Ibadi community and to try to gain followers. So it's a missionary activity. And he apparently has a whole lot of success in northern Africa, as do his colleagues. And the communities where he finds the most success and the most receptive communities for his message are among the northern African tribes that don't speak Arabic. So this is, again, another kind of parenthesis about North African history that if you look at a map of the spread of Islam, it looks really, really fast. And by the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century, it basically, if you were going to color it in green or something, the whole northern part of Africa would be green. But practically speaking, there's a very small minority of people who are in political control of those areas. And they are Arabic speaking, but the vast majority of people in northern Africa in the 8th and 9th centuries don't speak Arabic. And instead, they are what historians often refer to as Berber communities. Now, because I'm in Morocco and because I've been here for a while, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in contemporary Morocco, the term Berber is often not used anymore because it's regarded as somewhat pejorative. And instead, my Moroccan colleagues have a preference for the term Amazigh or Tamazight when referring to the language. But at the same time, I would say that the stuff that I was looking at, these late medieval texts, even all the way up into the 20th century, Berber or Lugha al-Berberiya would definitely have been the terms. So I'll close that parenthesis, but I wanted to point that out because I feel like I have to. I would say maybe as a final point about these autochthonous communities and Berber languages, one of the things that characterizes the text that we're going to talk about is the presence of non-Arabic phrases, sometimes long passages, written in what we would today call Tamazight, but written in Arabic script. And so it's pretty clear, even though Arabic is the language of scholarship for all these people, that the everyday language for everybody, up until very, very recently, would still have been Tamazight or Berber languages.
Wow. I would love to get back to that point about those texts and the Berber language in the manuscripts in the Ibadi communities. And also, thank you. It was a very thoughtful remark you made on the term Berber, as I wanted to ask you, and the justification and reasons for using this term. And you articulated very well. I would like to traverse from history and historic facts to geography. Travelers who are in the search of culturally authentic destinations in North Africa are advised to visit the UNESCO World Heritage Villages in Maghrib Valley, located in Algeria, which is one of the few remaining living pockets of Ibadi communities in the Maghrib region. I would like to know, have you visited these villages yourself? And if so, what is your thought and what is your experience encountering with those communities and visiting those towns?
So the short answer is yes. I have had the chance a couple of times to do some field work in the Mzab Valley. And the Mzab is a very special place. It's kind of in the pre-desert of the Sahara, so it's in a kind of rocky area of the desert of Algeria. And this community is a community that appears for the first time at the beginning of the period that I was studying, so around the 11th century or so. And it makes up 5 key towns that all sort of represent distinct settlements in the Sahara. And today they're linked by roads and by sort of towns that have appeared between them. But originally they were 5 different communities. And these communities are referred to as qusur. So they are kind of walled cities where Ibadi communities were able not just to protect themselves for many centuries, but also to be able to preserve the way of life that they believed in and wanted to follow. And I think to some extent, they've been able to continue to do that all the way up into the present. And so you really feel like these are places where Ibadis have consciously tried to preserve the traditions that they believe in and the way of life that they believe in. The thing that I have found most fascinating about the communities there and about the commitment to heritage there is that my Mzabi colleagues have been really at the forefront for the last 30 years of manuscript conservation and documentation. And that's because these places, in addition to all the other very cool things about them, they have really special architecture and amazing mosque architecture in particular, but they've also been home for a very long time to a rich manuscript tradition. And as a result, there are literally hundreds of private libraries in the Mzab Valley. And my colleagues there have spent the last 3 decades really developing their own methodology for studying those, for documenting them, for making manuscript catalogs, and for making people aware of how important the tradition of manuscripts is to the region. And so I think that the Mzab really stands out as a modern example for Ibadi communities worldwide, as a symbol and a model for how to protect this written material heritage in the present.
Amazing. I think it would be a perfect segue for us, as you mentioned, the tradition of preserving manuscripts in the Ibadi communities. We can pivot into the central theme of your research areas and your book, which is knowledge transmission and community building. What are the key components of knowledge transmission in the Ibadi tradition, and what critical role has it played for their community?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you're right. I like to think at least that it's at the heart of the arguments that I'm trying to make in the book. The way that I imagine knowledge transmission, not just for Ibadi communities, but maybe in general for Muslim communities, for religious communities, is very much a kind of symbiotic or interrelated tie between people and their books and their ideas. Ongoing movement of people and books and ideas that allow for the formation, the maintenance, and the transmission of a tradition. And even the idea of a tradition itself, like the word itself as something that's being passed on, is crucial to the idea. So the transmission can't take place without the people, but I also felt like the people needed the books and the books needed the people, and it was this kind of loop that just kept coming back and forth. That of course, all of us have limited lifespans, and so as long as we're around, we can, in person transmit ideas, but it's really helpful to be able to write those ideas down and to pass them along in books. But only having the books would also miss a really key element of the way that knowledge transmission took place. And so I began to think about those things as not just interrelated, but really inseparable from one another. And that was how I understood what knowledge transmission meant.
Amazing. Let's get back to one of these key elements of knowledge transmission you touched, books. And the types that has been in the Ibadi communities entitled as Sira, which has been frequently mentioned in your book. Can you tell us about this genre of literature? What is it? What does it contain? And what's the intended purpose of these texts?
Oh, that last part of the question is really cool. And I think it's also tied up in what the books are. So, Sira is a term that is usually associated with biographies. You can think of it mostly as a kind of stand-in for the word biography. There are some differences in terms of like who writes the biography and why they write it that might make it a little bit different than what we mean today by biography, but I think it's a pretty good translation. So there's one particular sira or biography in Islamic history that's really famous, and that's the one of the Prophet Muhammad. And that one's referred to as a sira nabawiyya, or the prophetic biography. And that's actually a whole genre of literature all by itself. There are tons of different versions of that story. In the case of Ibadis, it also has a similar kind of meaning, in the sense that a siyar, or the plural of the word siyar, these are biographies, but at least the way that I decided I was going to translate it and think about this genre was as collective biographies. And this has a really big fancy word called prosopography. But the basic idea is that it's a collective biography of a community. And that also, it both defines the book and tells you what they're for. Because if the idea of a biography is to say that this is a person and this is the story of that one person, and this is how you should understand that person's life, then the idea of the collective biography is to define this is the community and these are the people who belong to it, and this is why you should care about it. And so as I began to think about the siyar as a genre of collective biography, I began to think of them as the way that the Ibadi communities of Northern Africa in this period of time were able to draw the boundaries of the community. In other words, if Paul is not mentioned in the book, or Ray is not mentioned in the book, that suggests that they're not members of the community. And likewise, if they are mentioned in the book, then they are members of the community. So including or excluding people from the books became a way to sort of draw the boundaries of community. And those boundaries can expand over time as new sira were written. New biographies are written of the community because the community is changing and developing over time.
Wow, it's fascinating. So it means that by this particular type of literature, they preserve the history for generations. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one hand, what they're doing is keeping these stories of people and the circulation of texts that are stories about people. People themselves are circulating the stories about people. So it's, again, a kind of feedback loop or an echo chamber for creating this tradition. But then there are also very creative ways where including or excluding people can shape the way that you understand that history, and that history can change over time. So maybe to give you a concrete example, you had mentioned earlier about the role of Persians in Ibadi history. So yes, absolutely, there is this person, his name is Rustam, Ibn Rustam. But my colleague, Cyril Ayer in Lyon, has this really beautiful book that has come out in the last few years, where he makes this cool argument that I find really convincing, that the reason to include Persians in this genre of literature and in Ibadi history in North Africa is a way to connect them to an imperial past that gives them sort of political legitimacy. So there are these famous Persian dynasties, and by connecting him to this particular figure to a famous Persian dynasty, there's a kind of legitimacy and imperial power that comes with it. So not everybody is from a really famous family, but including or excluding people in these books is a way not just of preserving history, but actually of creating it and recreating it every time a new sira is created.
It's really astonishing. So there is a lot in those sira and siyar to tell us about the building blocks of those communities and how they have been shaped, and collective story of a community in North Africa. This is amazing. And I was just looking through your blog, Dirasat Ibadiyya, and I reckon that there was a post recently about one document and a research study about a French geographer commissioned to do some studies on Ibadi communities and manuscripts in the early 20th century. we have found out that the Rockefeller Foundation funded this French geographer to come into North Africa and start studying these manuscripts. I'm really interested to know what motivated these colonial powers and those American entities to support someone to do some studies on these manuscripts of Ibadis.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that this connects very much to what I was saying earlier about the experience of doing fieldwork. So as a graduate student, I admit this with no little amount of shame. I think that as somebody studying pre-modern history, I didn't often think about the modern political implications of the things that I was doing. I was thinking, well, I study the medieval period, so I'm not actually interested in what happened in the colonial period. I'm not interested in modern politics. I want to go and I want to study the past, and that's all there is to it. But as I became more aware of where these different manuscripts were, I had to face the reality that there were lots of collections in Europe, and that even the collections that were still in North Africa had been shaped by the experience of the colonial encounter with Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries in particular. To go back to why colonial powers would have been interested in Ibadi manuscripts, so there are a couple different reasons that I can think of off the top of my head. One is that for the French in particular, in what are today Algeria and Tunisia, which is where the majority of collections were, this was essentially a question of understanding better the people that they sought to control. So it's a kind of classic reason for the production of colonial knowledge. And there was a special fascination in Algeria with the Mzab Valley, because the Mzab Valley, given its geographic location, is only a lot later incorporated formally into the colony in Algeria by the French. And there's a period of sort of information and intelligence gathering that precedes the formal takeover of the Mzab Valley. So I think that on one level, there's a drive for colonial knowledge production simply to control the people that they were interested in controlling. And on the other hand, there's also the kind of interrelationship between academic study of stuff and political power, in the sense that even people who were not, for example, working directly with the military may have had their funding come from the government, from the colonial government, and the government was interested in supporting that research because it served its interests. And that's something certainly that continues all the way up to the present throughout the world. But I should say that each location sort of has a different explanation for why they would have been interested. So if I contrast what I just said about Algeria with the Italians in Libya, for example, the interest in Ibadi Islam really develops much later in the 20th century rather than the 19th century, because the Italians invade Tripoli in 1911 and attempt to control areas where Ibadis live for the next 20 years or so. And so the production of knowledge is definitely linked to the desire to understand and control people, but the 19th century looks quite different from the 20th century. And so although there are similarities, there are also a lot of differences that you'd have to account for if you were going to say, why are they interested? But if I had to boil it down to one, it would probably be that colonial knowledge production supports colonialism, and that's a good reason for colonial powers to have been interested.
While our main focus in this episode is not the impacts of colonialism on Ibadi communities and on a broader scope on the history of North Africa region, it's great that you scratched the surface of the modern political history and unpacked for us briefly the intended purposes of colonial knowledge production and its interplay with social and other factors in the region and in this context. Now, since we are very interested in visualizing things, and one of our main theme is knowledge transmission and education system of Ibadi communities, can you set us a scene that we can imagine how those training sessions look like in the Middle Ages? For example, what are the elements of these education systems? What do these training sessions look like? And how many people attend each session? And where do they take place?
I love the idea of trying to imagine this, but I should say that I am very much sort of imagining it based on, I like to think it's an informed imagination, but still, we can't be there, so we can't know for certain. But based on the descriptions that show up in these siyar, so one of the things that's great about the siyar books is that they are interested in talking about relationships among scholars and students and students and students and how they write books and how they study. So I can have some sense sort of how these things work. And at the beginning of the period that I was interested in the 11th century, there's the formation of this system that at least early on is referred to as the halqa system. And a halqa is basically a circle of people. And this is a system that persists in some ways all the way up into the present in different parts of the world. This is a traditional form of education that's not unique to Ibadis, not unique to Muslims. This is the way that most folks before the 19th century probably, would learn. And you would sit around in a circle or in some formation like that and listen to a central figure, or perhaps if everybody is kind of in the same role, you're simply discussing things. And it seems like, based on these descriptions, that the Sirah were actually read aloud, like most texts were. And reading is something that happens as a group up until very recently in human history. And certainly from the 11th to the 16th centuries, the periods that I'm interested in, books have this really central importance, but reading is not something you can do quietly by yourself in a corner. It's something that takes place in a school, or especially in a part of a mosque, where people are sitting around in a circle. The text is being read out loud, and that reading might be punctuated or interrupted by a central figure, a teacher, or perhaps multiple teachers, who are explaining what the text means. And it's also an opportunity for students, depending on how early they are in their career, to interrupt and raise questions and to challenge each other about the interpretation of the text. So the system of education is, again, not unique to Ibadis, but certainly something they would have shared with contemporaries in Northern Africa, where the text is being read out loud. People are talking about this text and discussing it in relation both to other texts and to everyday lived practice. And it's an interactive group activity.
It's too impressive. And I like different aspects you have explored in your book about this education system and knowledge transmission. And one of the prominent components of this system, unsurprisingly, is paper. How did the community scholars acquire paper, and what sort of medium they used for writing and preserving the text, which mattered so much and prized so much?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I tried to devote a chapter, and on purpose kind of in the middle of things. So it doesn't come at the beginning or the end of the book. It's just right there in the middle of the book. And I thought about paper. And that's because I became very preoccupied with the idea of where the books came from, because the books are mentioned in the books. And so that tells me that there's a lot of paper moving around. And so I became very interested in thinking about, where did they get this paper? Where was it produced? So paper originally comes from a much earlier period to the east in Central Asia. Oftentimes people talk about it as having come from China, but it's kind of the relationship between Central Asia and China that create paper and begin to move it to the west. And North Africa is kind of unusual to think about in terms of paper, because even as Western Asia and certainly Central Asia adopt paper in an earlier period of time, all the way up into the modern period, Northern Africans often used parchment. So that is a writing surface that's made primarily from the skin of animals. And part of that just has to do with, like, if I walk outside here in Morocco into the street, there's a very good chance that at some point I will encounter a giant herd of sheep. And that's because there's tons of sheep and goats in Northern Africa. And so it's an easy thing to be able to acquire. It's labor intensive, though, to create parchment. And so it's not surprising that when traders begin to show up with paper, that it becomes a very attractive alternative to something like parchment. So Northern Africa does have centers of paper production, especially down the hill from where I am right now in Fez and closer by in the Iberian Peninsula. And at least in the early medieval period, when paper shows up, it does come from those places as well as from east in places like Egypt and Syria. But for the places where Ibadis live, it just wasn't going to make sense to create paper, because paper requires tons of water to be able to create it, at least to be able to make nice paper. So one of the things that happens in the 11th to the 16th century period that I was interested in is paper becomes a lot more abundant, not because it's being made locally, but because, as the travels of Ibn Battuta show you, there are people moving around in all different kinds of directions, and that they carry stuff with them. And one of those things that they carry with them is paper. But from the 13th century, let's say, onward, that's kind of unidirectional. from north to south in the Mediterranean in terms of the paper trade. So pretty quickly, there are a couple of changes in technology to the generation of paper beginning in the 13th century and then developing every century after that make European paper a really good choice for Northern African scholars. There are people bringing that paper to the major ports in Northern Africa. There are traders that then take it into the interior to places where people like Ibadis live, but also everybody else. And everybody begins to use European paper in larger quantities. Things that will also happen is paper will become cheaper, like way cheaper in later centuries. And so that will mean that it's a lot easier to get a hold of. So it's the omnipresence of paper that makes a big difference, mostly through these trading routes. And the other component of a manuscript is often its cover, which is usually made of leather. And that does tend to be made locally, as do the other elements like the string or the ink that's used to produce the manuscript. But the core element of paper pretty early on is something that comes from the outside and circulates throughout Northern Africa as a result of trade routes.
Wow. Paper itself can exhaust an episode, I think. We should put aside a single episode for the story of paper. And I'm sure that in each region in the Islamic lands, paper has its own unique evolution path. Thank you for bringing up all those interesting elements of paper and paper making. Just moving from the paper to books, we know that the Ibadi communities have valued books and libraries as tangible assets that sit at the center of the tradition. Can you explain the significance of this asset and the practices related to book collection among Ibadi scholars, and what proportion of those precious book collections have been preserved for us? You have mentioned part of the answer earlier on, but if there would be anything you would like to add on.
The significance of the object of the book, like we said earlier, is in part related to the transmission of knowledge. But I think this is not something that is unique to Ibadi communities in Northern Africa. There's such a rich tradition of manuscript culture throughout Northern Africa that's very much related to the traditions of manuscripts in West Africa. They're the same paper and often the same texts that are moving across those different regions. And so Ibadis in that way are kind of part of a regional or geographic love for books and love for paper. I think that although my focus is so myopic, it tends to be focused on Ibadi libraries and manuscript collections. The things that I have learned over time and continue to learn now about the way that manuscript cultures work, the way that libraries form, and the interests that scholars had, I think if I were to just shift it a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, I would find that Maliki Muslim scholars or Hanafi Muslim scholars in the region throughout history have been just as interested in these things as well. So I guess that's all a way of saying that Ibadis are kind of part of a regional fascination and love for books that you'd find in other communities as well. In terms of the things that have been survived, that have survived, that's a really interesting question. I would lean on some of my colleagues especially from the Mzab Valley, who I've had this conversation with before, who have, through the extensive work, much more extensive than my own work with manuscript libraries that they've done, have said, at this point, we probably know about all of the major works by Ibadi scholars. If we want to define Ibadi text as it's an Ibadi scholar writing it, we probably know about most of that stuff. And we're talking about maybe a couple thousand individual titles. We're really at this point sort of moving to a point where we want to document things like private letters and informal writings that are not like formal compositions. So to hear them tell it, it seems like the vast majority of texts that were composed in the pre-modern period have survived. There are a couple of really high-profile missing texts, but it's astonishing how much of the stuff has actually survived. And from my perspective, it's even more impressive how many copies of things have survived. So one of the things that I tried to do in the book was I tried to figure out how many copies of each of the 5 Sirah books I was interested in are still around. And there was a pretty surprising number. It's not a massive corpus. It's a couple hundred manuscripts. But if you sort of look at different books that are composed by Ibadi scholars over time, there are a lot of copies of most of the books out there. And that I think speaks to, maybe to sort of bring us back to the love of books and the tradition of manuscripts, that speaks to a continuous tradition of manuscript culture from the medieval period all the way up into the present. And maybe this is a kind of final point that was a discovery for me, probably not a discovery for other people, but was that although I was interested primarily in books that were created from the 11th to the 16th centuries, the vast majority of copies that survive are actually from a later period of time. And there's a way that you can look at that as like a defeat, like I failed to find the books that I was planning on finding. I didn't look at that many medieval books. But there's also something really amazing about the fact that all those medieval books were copied over and over and over again into the 20th century. And it shows a kind of dedication to manuscript culture and book culture all the way up into the present.
It's so fascinating and also makes me think why at all we don't hear and we have no knowledge about this rich knowledge, history, and this rich tradition of bookmaking, book preserving, copying, compiling. It's like a very extensive and very advanced labor division involved in this knowledge transmission system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I had an opportunity to do as a graduate student that I think anybody who works on material culture of any kind probably can share this kind of experience. So I had a chance while I was doing my fieldwork to spend some time in a bookbinding workshop in Tunis, learning a bit about the construction of books. And one of the things you immediately become aware of when you begin to try to make books is that there was tons of labor involved in that. And to make a really beautiful book, in particular, every element of the book really is its own art form and its own form of labor. And the fact that what you have sitting in front of you, this volume that has not just a binding that's held up for hundreds of years, but paper that's held up and ink that looks really beautiful all the way up into the present, you realize how much labor went into each of these objects. So yeah, I couldn't agree more that it becomes fascinating to think about the labor that's behind it and the love of that labor that had to come with it.
It's like a product of love and labor together, and this makes it very beautiful. And I would now like to bring in a little bit of flavor of Ibn Battuta to our conversation. Ibn Battuta, in the beginning of his travel setting out from Tangier when he was only 22 years old, recounts his stay in Tlemcen in modern-day Algeria and named his companions two judges from Ifriqiya and a few merchants from Tunisia. Although we don't know for sure if those companions were from Ibadi communities, but these accounts happened in the modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, geographical hubs hosting Ibadi Muslims at the time, which shows the full integration of Ibadi Muslims into network of knowledge and commerce. Let's listen to a few passages from Rihla and pick up our conversation after that.
I came then to the city of Tlemcen, the sultan of which at that time was Abu Tashifin Abd al-Rahman ibn Zayyan, and my arrival chanced to coincide with the visit of the two envoys of the king of Ifriqiya, the Sultan Abu Yahya. These were the qadis for marriages in the city of Tunis, namely Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Nafzawi and the pious Sheikh Abu Abdullah Muhammad Zubaydi, an ethnic derived from a village Zubayd on the coast near Mahdiya. He was one of the eminent scholars of his time and died in the year 740 Hijri. On the day of my arrival at Tlemcen, these two envoys left the town, and one of the brethren advised me to travel in their company. I consulted the will of Almighty God in regard to this, and after a stay of 3 nights in Tlemcen to procure what I needed, I left, riding after them with all speed, and on reaching the town of Miliana, overtook them there. This was in the time of the summer heats, and both of the qadis fell sick, on account of which we stopped for a space of 10 nights. We then set out again, but the illness of one of them had taken a serious turn. So we stopped for 3 nights by a stream at a distance of 4 miles from Miliana. The qadi breathed his last in the forenoon of the 4th day, and his son and his colleague returned to Miliana and buried him there. I left them at this point and pursued my journey with a company of merchants from Tunis, amongst them being Al-Hajj Mas'ud ibn al-Muntasir, Al-Hajj al-Aduli, and Muhammad ibn al-Hajar. On reaching the town of Al-Jazair, we camped outside it for some days until the Sheikh Abu Abdullah and the son of the Qadi arrived. Then we went together through the Matija to the mountain oaks, Jabal al-Zan, and so reached the town of Bijaya.
After listening to these interesting passages from Ibn Battuta, I would like to connect it to the areas you have touched in your book as well. You have thoroughly examined the instrumental role of traveling and trade for Ibadi scholars. What was the connection for Ibadi elites to commerce and commerce routes in the Middle Ages in the Maghrib, North Africa?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think in addition to the role of the Hajj that we mentioned earlier, which is always sort of at once a religious and economic undertaking because it takes a really long time and it's super expensive. So unless you're just really independently wealthy, you're probably doing the Hajj as part of merchant activity, or you join merchant activity in order to be able to get there. So that's sort of one thing that I would say. Another, though, is that within Northern Africa, it seems pretty clear that especially early on in Ibadi history, there's a clear link between commerce and the spread of the religious community and networks of religious scholars and students. And one clear connection is with West Africa and the Saharan trade routes that link Northern Africa and Western Africa. There are a couple of really wonderful studies from several years ago that look at the involvement of Ibadis in the Northern African slave trade, that find Ibadis sort of in the Sira books themselves, mention that Ibadis are, for example, working in different locations in the Sahara or in Western Africa, that show that there are these links. Or occasionally you might find that sort of in someone so-and-so's biography, you have the fact that they also happen to study in this place, which is really far away from the place that they used to live and operate. And so you can, over time, begin to kind of draw a geographic network map of all of these different people across time and space. And the only real way that any of these people could have gotten around is through commerce. Either they themselves being merchants, which is often the case, or jumping onto a caravan with another group of people who can allow them to move around. And that is something that we learn about in a whole lot of detail from the rihla literature, the travel literature of somebody like Ibn Battuta, and allows us, even though we don't have any travel literature like that from Ibadis, for example, you're absolutely right that they allow you to situate other people in a bigger context of people moving around. And there's a stunning feature of pre-modern Islamic learning that people are moving from all the way from somewhere like the Iberian Peninsula to China. I mean, that is just really impressive when you think about how far these people are moving. And although Ibadis certainly have their own versions of those things, they tend to be focused on particular geographic regions. So Northern Africa is much more connected to West Africa. Egypt is much more connected to the world of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Obviously, Oman and East Africa are more connected to the Indian Ocean than Northern Africa. But there is still just a constant movement of scholars and merchants that are often the same people.
Wow, it is stunning, especially as you think that the same path and routes were used for transmitting and trading the commodities like spices and textiles and all other precious commodities from one place to another. They were the same paths were used for transmitting knowledge across different geographic hubs and connecting people through these commerce routes.
Maybe just as a kind of final thought there, I mean, it's the work that's been done on Saharan trade, for example, it tends to focus on a lot later of a period. But to your point that you just made, it is really cool that it's not just the ideas, but also the books that carry those ideas that move along the same paths. And the books themselves, although we tend to think about books as sort of receptacles of knowledge, are also commercial items that are made up of other commercial items. So paper is being traded, leather is being traded, and all the other elements that are needed to make the book. And then when the book is made, it's also sold as a commodity. And so there is this amazing interplay between economics and religion in that moment.
That was an amazing point. And we can just move on to the last section of our conversation, which is all about the adaptation journey of Ibadi communities and their encounters with other cultures and other sects and other movements, actually, like Sufism. We know that in the Rihla, Ibn Battuta has described many cases that has encountered with Sufi orders and Sufi sheikhs in different locations in North Africa. Shazaliya, for example, is one of them, which he has included its litany in his book as well.
The prayer of the sea attributed to Ash-Shadhili. He made a journey every year through Upper Egypt and across the Red Sea, and when he was on board the ship, he used to recite this prayer every day. His disciple still recite it every day, and it runs as follows.
فنعم الرب ربي ونعم الحسب حسبي تنصر من تشاء وأنت العزيز الرحيم أسألك العصمة في الحركات والسكنات والكلمات والإرادات والخطرات من الشكوك والظنون والأوهام الساترات بالقلوب عن مطالعة الغيوب فقد ابتلي المؤمنون وزلزلوا زلزالا شديدا وإذ يقول المنافقون والذين في قلوبهم مرض ما وعدنا الله ورسوله إلا غرورا فثبتنا وانصرنا وسخر لنا هذا البحر كما سخرت البحر لموسى وسخرت النار لإبراهيم وسخرت الجبال والحديد لداود وسخرت الريح والشياطين والجن لسليمان وسخر لنا كل بحر هو لك في الأرض والسماء والملك والملكوت وبحر الدنيا وبحر الآخرة وسخر لنا كل شيء يا من بيده ملكوت كل شيء كان يا عين صاد كاف يا عين صاد كاف يا عين صاد انصرنا فإنك خير الناصرين وافتح لنا فإنك خير الفاتحين واغفر لنا فإنك خير الغافرين وارحمنا فإنك خير الراحمين وارزقنا فإنك خير الرازقين واهدنا ونجينا من القوم الظالمين وهب لنا ريحا طيبة كما هي في علمك وانشرها علينا من خزائن رحمتك واحملنا بها حمل الكرامة مع السلامة والعافية في الدين والدنيا والآخرة إنك على كل شيء قدير اللهم يسر لنا أمورنا مع الراحة لقلوبنا وأبداننا والسلامة والعافية في دنيانا وديننا وكلنا صاحبا في سفرنا وخليفة في أهلنا واطمس على وجوه أعدائنا وامسخهم على مكانتهم فلا يستطيعون المضيء ولا المجيء إلينا ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون شاهد الوجوه شاهد الوجوه شاهد الوجوه وعلى الوجوه للحي القيوم وقد خاب من حمل ظلما طاغين عين عين سين قاف.
After listening to the beautiful prayer of the sea attributed to Imam Shazali, recited by a group of reciters from Tunisia, we can pick up our conversation. We know that the Shazaliya was one out of a vast array of Sufi orders growing rapidly in 13th century and 14th century North Africa. How did Ibadi communities respond to the growth of Sufism in North Africa, and how did they adapt to this new force?
I think that one of the things that's really cool about the history of Sufism in Northern Africa is that people have often, especially if they're not super familiar with Sufism, they have the particular image of someone associated with Sufism in their head that maybe isn't necessarily both a jurist and a merchant and a Sufi. They sort of think about being a Sufi as their job, but the reality, right, is that we're all complex people with different elements and dimensions to us, and Sufis are no different. And so pretty early on in Northern African history, Sufism, mercantile activity, and jurisprudence are all things that are interrelated with one another. But that, for at least in the earliest stage of Islamic history, is something that's largely limited to the coast. Whereas Ibadis remain a strong demographic community up into the 11th century. And it's really then that things begin to change in Northern Africa. So there's, on the one hand, a big demographic shift. There are a lot of Arabic-speaking communities that move gradually into Northern Africa over time that are going to change things. But then there's also, as you mentioned, the gradual spread of Sufism. And in North Africa, Sufism usually also means Maliki Islam. And so as communities adopt Sufism or adopt Maliki Islam, that begins to sort of chip away the demographic dominance of Ibadis in the Maghrib. And so you have, there are a couple of really wonderful sort of micro-histories that try to look at how this would have happened on the ground. But basically what happens is with the growth of Sufism and the growth of Malikism, that means in turn the contraction or the lessening of the number of Ibadis in Northern Africa. And they become, slowly but surely, become a demographic minority community that is largely located in a handful of geographic pockets. And a lot of the places where they used to be the majority of the communities there slowly become Maliki communities. So much so that, like, in terms of modern memory, it's very difficult sometimes for even members of Maliki communities in North Africa to realize that they live in a place that used to be very much the center of Ibadi thought and commercial activity. So it's in part the contraction of the Ibadi community, the shrinking of the Ibadi community, and its concentration in geographic pockets that's being tracked in the creation of these books in the first place. So why would you need in the 11th century to start drawing the boundaries of a religious community? One of the reasons is that religious community is under threat, that it is shrinking. And so the books are in some ways a response to the demographic shrinkage of the community over time. And as the community gets bigger in the Sirah tradition and includes more and more people, in reality, what's happening is the opposite, that the geographic expanse of Ibadi communities and the numerical just simply the quantity of Ibadis in Northern Africa is actually getting smaller. So the books are in some way a way of protecting the boundaries of the community itself.
It's beautiful that how expanding or shrinking community has impacted the tradition itself and triggered other practices for preserving that knowledge and tradition. That's really amazing. I think that you have partly covered my next question, which was about the encounter of Ibadi communities in the face of Sunni Islam. You mentioned Maliki, which is a sect or branch under Sunni Islam. You also use a term mazhabization in your book, and which means that maybe some Ibadi communities have converted to Maliki Islam or adopted the Maliki Islam, or maybe they have adopted other practices to preserve their own Ibadi tradition. I think you have covered them all, but is there anything else you would like to add into this area?
Yeah, I would add something about that term methodization, which is first, I should say, it's not my word. It's a word by an English historian of Ibadism, John Wilkinson. And I think it's a really convincing argument that one of the things that's happening in this period that I was studying in the 11th to the 16th centuries is Ibadi textual traditions, at least, begin to look a whole lot more like their Sunni counterparts. And part of that's about preservation. Part of it's simply because that's what Islam and that's what Muslim communities begin to look like in the period. And so Ibadis are adapting to the textual traditions that they're operating in. They're studying with Sunnis in madrasas and in mosques in different parts of Northern Africa and outside of it. And so they begin to adopt a lot of the same forms as their Sunni counterparts. And in some cases, that does end up leading to conversion of formerly Ibadi communities into Sunni communities. But madhabization is really more about the sort of taking of Sunni forms for Ibadi knowledge, right? So to use a pretty famous example, hadith, so these are sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad that are passed on through generations. In Sunni traditions, there's a very formal way that you do that. Like you have to say where it comes from and who passed this on to whom and so on and so forth. That looked a lot different in Ibadi Islam until the 11th and the 12th centuries, when Ibadis began to write their hadith books, their sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad books in the same way. And so that's part of what John Wilkinson was trying to argue, which is that it's not that the Ibadi tradition didn't exist before that, it's that the form of Ibadi tradition after that takes on the shape of a madhab or a school in the same way that it does in Sunni Islam. And I found it a really, really convincing argument. And I saw that it was happening with these books that I was looking at too.
Thank you for clarifying. So this term and this process doesn't mean necessarily converting to Maliki or Sunni Islam, but it's more just adopting the form, but not necessarily the content. So they just change and adapt themselves to the form of Sunni Islam. And get back quickly to the contemporary context. What is the current population and status of Ibadi Muslims?
So this is a tricky question because the places where Ibadi communities in the present live don't usually, as part of their census process, don't count people according to their religious traditions. So the most valuable place, for example, to know how many Ibadis live there would be Oman, where certainly the numerical majority live today. But the Omani government, in part by design, does not count people based on their religious traditions. But if, as is often floated out there as a number, if about half of the population of the Sultanate of Oman today is Ibadi, I think that the population is a little over 5 million. So we would be talking about 2.5 million people. And then maybe add 100, 200,000 people across Northern Africa. It would be a really rough estimate of somewhere between 2 and 3 million people worldwide. There are also, however, communities now really all over the world. So you'd have to take into account communities that live in Kentucky in the United States or Montreal in Canada. So there are communities worldwide, but there's no hard and fast number. What I can say, though, is certainly in Northern Africa, we're talking about numerically a very small community compared to the sort of larger population of Northern Africa. And I think, though, that because they're such a small community, that's also contributed to the second sort of part of the question about how that tradition has been preserved in the present, because there's a ton of work done in contemporary Ibadi communities, and I've had a chance to participate in some of that work to preserve written traditions, to preserve architectural traditions and relationships among people. The Sultanate of Oman today plays a really important role in connecting different communities. They have some of the financial resources that other communities don't have. And so they've used some of those financial resources to, for example, publish a lot of Ibadi books, to help finance mosques in East Africa and Northern Africa, and also to invite Ibadi communities from other parts of the world to Oman to study Ibadi jurisprudence or history. And that has been really important for the maintenance of the tradition. In Northern Africa, there are tons of cultural associations in the Mzab Valley, on the island of Jerba, and even in the Jebel Nafusa in what is today northwestern Libya, that have actively participated in the preservation of that tradition as well. And so I see there's a sort of combination of a religious-inspired effort to preserve the tradition today and based on a shared religious identity, and a kind of academic one as well to continue to study and to understand the history of these communities all the way up into the present.
Your interesting facts added another layer of knowledge into context of Ibadis in the contemporary context. Thank you a lot. For the last question, I would like to leave it to you. If you have any work upcoming you would like to talk about, if not, you would like to add something as a final thought or comments, it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to. So they're related to one another. So the sort of global comment that I would make, if it hasn't already been clear, but that I really want to emphasize, is that the work that I've had the opportunity to do from my time as a graduate student all the way up into the present has really been a collective effort of a lot of different people. I really couldn't have done any of the things that I have done if I hadn't had the support and the access that I have from members of the Ibadi community in the contemporary world, right? So I was interested in medieval stuff, but it's really the contemporary Ibadi community that allowed me to do all of these different things. I've learned a tremendous amount from my colleagues in different parts of Northern Africa and Oman, and I have received a ton of help accessing different kinds of libraries, but also sort of understanding what it is that I'm looking at, understanding the place of these libraries in Northern African history and in Ibadi history. So I'm deeply grateful to those communities for the continued support that they've offered me. And I do consider it a responsibility of myself that when I'm given the platform like this one, which is so wonderful to have the chance to talk about my work, that I also recognize that the work that I do is actually the work that they do too, and that I couldn't do mine without them. As a final point in terms of what I've been working on lately, and again, that's related, is I've been working with a team in Libya in particular, an organization called Turathna, which means our heritage. And it's an organization in Libya that's been working on documenting and in some cases digitizing our private manuscript libraries. And that work has become a kind of whole parallel path to all the historical research that I've done. I've been trying to do these projects with people for the last few years, and I love that we've been able to move that work most recently into Libya. And it's not a coincidence that I'm also working on another book now on the history of Ibadi communities in Libya. And I'm still interested in books and still interested in the movement of people. And what exactly that book will be and what it will look like, I'm not 100% sure yet, but it's mostly about the formation of private libraries, private manuscript collections in that part of the world, and how it has contributed to Ibadi history, Islamic history, Libyan history, and world history.
Wow, it should be an intriguing theme, and we very much look forward to reading that when it takes shape. And I would like to thank you for this amazing tour you guided us through. We explored a lot of fascinating areas, and I'm sure that it would be very interesting for our listeners equally. Thank you very much, Paul, for making time and for being our guest.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. This has been really, really fun. And what a tremendous honor just to have a chance to talk for a while about things that I adore and things that you're interested in. So thank you so much.
Our editor and creative consultant is Kate O'Connell. Erdogan Kars from Monash University and Ashkan Bahrani from Al Akhawain University are the content advisors. Frank Joachim read the passages from the Troubles of Ibn Battuta. The music is composed by Ali Gogin and Tia Goodwin, cover art designer. All the passages from Ibn Battuta observations have been selected from the English translation The Troubles of Ibn Battuta, translated from Arabic to English by Hamilton Gibb and Charles Beckingham, published for the Hakluyt Society in 5 volumes. You can follow Oriental Journeys on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also check out our website www.theorientaljourneys.com, which contains key information and codes on each episode.